Did you know that King Solomon had 1,000 wives? You might wonder what else caused his fall from grace. This video will help you understand the story of King Solomon, with all the lessons and deeper meanings it has. The story of Solomon is told in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. In the 10th century BC, Solomon was born into the royal family of Israel, the son of King David and Bathsheba. Solomon's reign as king began in a sort of scandal. He was the fourth son, so you might be wondering why his siblings were not chosen. The first and most important reason is that God chose him. This was told through the prophet Nathan in 1 Chronicles 22:9-10, who crowned him according to the law of the land. In ancient Israel, the coronation of kings was a significant event. This crowning was solely done by God's instruction through his prophet. The process typically began with the anointing of the new king by the prophet, who would pour sacred oil over the individual's head. This showed God's blessing and the divine appointment of the king. Following the anointing, the new king was then publicly proclaimed in a significant location where he reaffirmed his commitment to uphold God's laws and commandments. When we look closer at some of Solomon's older siblings, it can help us understand God's choice more. David's first son, Amnon, committed a grave sin against his family and ultimately died from the consequences. Sadly, the second son, Chileab, died at an early age. David's third son, Absalom, despite being the favorite son, tried to rebel against his father and take the throne by force. He too would die in these attempts. This led the fourth son, Adonijah, to be the next in line. What did Adonijah do that made him disqualified from being king? The answer to that tells the story of Solomon's rise to power. When King David's reign was nearing its end and his health had begun to decline, there was uncertainty about his successor. As the king, David had certain men who were close to his heart and who were after his best no matter what. One of such men was Zadok the priest, who was an important figure during David's reign and during Solomon's, as we will soon see. He was a descendant of Aaron, the first high priest, and came from the priestly line of Eleazar. Zadok was loyal to David during Absalom's rebellion against David. Also, there was Benaiah, who was one of David's mighty warriors and served as the commander of David's bodyguard. He was known for his bravery and loyalty to David. Another one of these men was Nathan the prophet. He played a critical role in several key events in David's life, including confronting David about his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. Nathan was influential in guiding David spiritually and politically. Going back to the story, David's old age and feeble condition evidently convinced Adonijah that it was time to show the people that he was the successor to the throne. He set up a royal processional, which was a group of royal stakeholders, and he sought the support of important people. He sought support from Joab, the commander of the military, Abiathar, the high priest, the other princes of the court, and David's personal staff. And then he prepared a great feast. He deliberately excluded those loyal to Solomon as the successor, including Zadok, another important priest, Benaiah, one of the military commanders, the mighty men who were probably David's personal bodyguards, and the prophet Nathan. Adonijah was going to recreate an entire coronation process all at his own wish, but along the line something happened. Adonijah's plan was thwarted when Nathan heard what Adonijah was doing and reported it to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. His warning to her that her life as well as Solomon's life was in danger illustrates one of the problems with a monarchical system of government. Because of the competition that typically existed in the royal family itself, the new king often assassinated all his brothers and other possible heirs who might pose any threat to his rule. Moving swiftly, Bathsheba and Nathan joined together to bring Adonijah's manipulations to the attention of King David. When David learned that Adonijah sought to take the throne, he quickly appointed Solomon as co-regent. David instructed the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, the commander of his personal guard, to take Solomon to Gihon, a significant and publicly visible location in Jerusalem. Despite his father's blessing, Solomon still needed further support to secure the throne. For divine approval, in addition to God's direct support, the priest Zadok anointed Solomon with oil from the sacred tabernacle, symbolizing divine approval. For military support, Solomon had the assistance of Benaiah, who commanded David's royal guards. All of this combined stopped David's fourth son, Adonijah, from taking the throne, and instead led Solomon to fulfill God's wish. Following the anointing and proclamation, Solomon was brought back to the royal palace, where he sat on the throne of David, further endorsing his reign. Celebrations ensued, marked by great rejoicing and the support of the people, signaling the acceptance of Solomon's kingship. David's clear endorsement of Solomon, along with the swift and public nature of the coronation ceremony, helped to prevent any potential rebellion by Adonijah and secured Solomon's position as the new king of Israel. What deeper meaning can we learn from God's choice of Solomon to be king? We can see God's ability to redeem. God chose Solomon, even though he was the son of Bathsheba, a relationship that started with sin. The sin with Bathsheba was that David, Solomon's father, saw her bathing, desired her, and committed adultery with her. This shows that God is in control and can achieve his plans despite human mistakes. It proves that God can turn bad situations into something good for his bigger plan. Solomon was not just a man chosen by God, he also had amazing qualities that made him such an exceptional leader until he fell. He was wise, and he had a heart that feared God. When he ascended the throne, he sought after God, and God gave him the opportunity to ask for whatever he wanted. Solomon humbly acknowledged his inability to rule well and unselfishly asked God for the wisdom he would need to rule God's people justly. God gave him wisdom, and even though he did not ask, God showered him with so much wealth. In fact, the Bible records that King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. God also gave Solomon peace on all sides during most of his reign. One common illustration of Solomon's wisdom is his judging a dispute over the identity of the true mother of an infant child. Solomon proposed splitting the living child in half, knowing that the true mother would prefer to lose her son to another woman than to have him killed. Solomon was not only wise in his rule, but had great general wisdom as well. His wisdom was renowned in his day. The Queen of Sheba traveled 200 miles to verify the rumors of his wisdom and grandeur. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. Solomon proved not only to be knowledgeable, but to have put his wisdom into action in the way his kingdom functioned. Solomon wrote many proverbs and songs and completed many building projects. Solomon also built a fleet of ships and acquired tons of gold from Ophir, with Hiram, king of Tyre, as a partner. Perhaps Solomon's most important building project was completing the Jewish temple that his father David always wanted to build. He followed David's instructions and provisions in doing this. Solomon was an amazing king with these qualities just mentioned. However, he had some unsavory qualities too that eventually caused him to fall, chief of which was his unhealthy love for women. There is no problem with loving women. In fact, Scripture commands that we do that, but Solomon had an unhealthy love for women. The book of 1 Kings 11 says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, such as the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. There are two obvious problems here. First, that he loved foreign women who worshipped other gods and brought pagan influences to Israel. Second, that he loved many women, rejecting God's plan from the beginning for one man and one woman to become one flesh in marriage. God gave a general warning to all Israel to not intermarry with these nations, because surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. For all Solomon's great wisdom, he did not have the wisdom to apply this simple command to his own life. Having multiple wives was common for kings in this era for multiple reasons. The first being able to have more children. As you can see from Solomon's story, the firstborn is not necessarily the best king to rule. With more children, these kings hope to produce a child worthy of being heir. Solomon also married several women to form relationships with other countries. Marrying a princess from a different land could help Israel gain powerful allies. Solomon probably did what many of us do. He somehow thought that he would be the exception, that he would escape the consequences of this sin, despite seeing how it affected others. Solomon learnt an unforgettable lesson from this, as we will soon see. Not minding God's command, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. This is an almost unbelievable number of marriage partners. His wives were considered princesses, but his concubines were legal partners without the same standing as wives. All said, Solomon had far more marriage partners than any man could possibly give attention to. In the cultural context of the day, a concubine was a legal mistress. Many prominent men in the Old Testament, like Abraham, Jacob, Caleb, Saul, had concubines, but Solomon had the highest number ever. You may be wondering why that was. Well, firstly, we can say that Solomon had so many marriage partners because of his own lust. This is an example of the principle that if one wife is not enough to satisfy a man, then 1,000 wives will not be enough. When a man is unsatisfied with the woman God gave to him, the problem is with him, not with his wife. 1,000 women cannot satisfy the lust of man. Solomon should have listened to Proverbs 27:20. Hell and destruction are never full, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. Secondly, we can say he followed the bad example of his father David, who had many wives and concubines himself. Also, we can say that Solomon had so many marriage partners because of his lust for power and prestige. In those days, a large harem was a status symbol. It said to the world, "Look how many wives and children I can support. Look how many women I have authority over." Solomon's desire for worldly prestige led him to these ungodly marriages. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Someone made a comment on this and said it would have been useless to argue with Solomon for the claims of idols. He could at once, by his wisdom, have annihilated all infidel arguments and have established the existence and unity of God. But step by step, he was led by silken cords, a captive, to the worship of other gods. There's something very interesting to note here. Did you see that Solomon had more than one wife and David had more than one wife? 15, actually. David spiritually survived this failing and Solomon did not survive it. Why? David was a man whose heart was tender towards God and repentant. When he slept with Bathsheba, he initially acted like nothing happened, but when the prophet Nathan showed him a true picture of himself, he was broken and repentant. With fasting and solitude, he apologized to God for days. David's sin did not turn his heart away from the Lord, but Solomon's did. This shows us that it is possible for a particular sin in one person to be a hindrance that they would do better without, while in another person that sin is the cause of ruin. David's lack of romantic and sexual restraint hindered him, but on the other hand, it destroyed Solomon. David no doubt hoped that his children would be better than he and find more victory in the areas of life that troubled him. Sadly, David's sons found less victory in controlling the lust of the flesh. Unfortunately, Solomon followed other gods. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for these different gods. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." God promised the entire kingdom of Israel to the descendants of David forever, if they only remained obedient. David reminded Solomon of this promise shortly before his death, but David's generation could not remain faithful even one generation. Solomon's kingdom was an outstanding example of wealth, military power, and prestige. Yet the true security of Israel did not rest in any of those things. It rested in the blessing of God and in the obedience and faithfulness of their king, but because of Solomon's unfaithfulness to God's commands, all that was about to change. Did you notice God's last statement there? Even in this great judgment, God mingled undeserved mercy with deserved judgment. God announced that the kingdom will be divided, and part of it will be loyal to the descendants of David, and part of it will be under a different dynasty. So far, we have seen who Solomon was before the fall. We talked about the qualities he had as a man that made God choose him to be king. We have also seen his other side, the qualities that he had that made him fall. So let's address the elephant in the room. How did Solomon fall? The fall of Solomon had three parts to it, the first being that he fell from divine favor to divine disfavor. Solomon, who was chosen by God to be king and favored amongst his brethren, was now about to get the kingdom yanked from, and not just him, but from his entire lineage. How does a man go from being the center of God's favor and experiencing divine wisdom to becoming a castaway from royalty? God said that he will take the kingdom from him and give it to his subordinate. Next, Solomon lost his fellowship and intimacy with God. This is probably the most devastating thing for a man to lose. Solomon must have enjoyed deep fellowship with God being the king and receiving instructions from God on what to do. God granted him a peaceful reign and even let him finish the project that his father, David, was not allowed to. This fellowship he had with God had taken a hit as a result of his idolatry. When we stray from God, we expose ourselves to all the harms and dangers that he had been shielding us from, because he who breaks the hedge, the serpent, shall bite. This was exactly the third dimension Solomon experienced in his fall. Enemies began to rise up against him, and God allowed them to, because Solomon had strayed. The first adversary was Hadad the Edomite. He was a descendant of the king in Edom, which David and his army had once invaded and destroyed. Hadad was a survivor of this war by escaping to Egypt. But when Hadad heard in Egypt that David had passed and that Joab, the commander of David's army, was also no more, he sought permission from the Pharaoh to return to his homeland. We are not told specifically how Hadad troubled or was an adversary to Solomon, but we can take a guess and say that he was out for revenge. Next came Rezon from the north country. God allowed adversaries to come against Solomon from both north and south. In some ways, men and women are shaped by their adversaries, and especially by their response to those adversaries. Rezon was a slave who escaped from his master and had become a sort of gang lord. He gathered a band of raiders that were left after David, Solomon's father, had destroyed their home. Rezon and his band stayed in Damascus and was notorious in that place. When his attention was turned to Israel once more, he caused more trouble than Hadad throughout the rest of the days of Solomon. The third enemy that rose against Solomon was Jeroboam, and he was an adversary in a different way. He didn't come to seek revenge, rather, he came to take over entirely. Jeroboam was someone you would not expect to rebel because he was Solomon's servant, and then he was also a fellow Israelite, but Solomon did something that caused him to rebel. Solomon had built and repaired the damages to the city of David, his father. Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon, seeing that the young man was industrious, made him the officer over all the labor force of the house of Joseph. This may seem like a promotion, and it is not immediately apparent why these construction projects caused him to rebel. However, we need to consider the cultural context of things. Jeroboam's rebellion against Solomon was rooted in a combination of political and social dissatisfaction that had built up during Solomon's reign. Solomon's extensive building projects, including the construction of the temple and his palace, required significant labor and resources. Many Israelites were compulsorily enlisted into forced labor, and the heavy taxation needed to support these projects placed a significant burden on the people, leading to widespread discontent. Additionally, Solomon's favoritism towards the tribe of Judah, his own tribe, at the expense of the northern tribes, further fueled resentment. His introduction of idolatry through his foreign wives and the building of high places for their gods also alienated many who were loyal to Yahweh. Jeroboam, an Ephraimite and a capable administrator in Solomon's court, was appointed as an overseer of the labor force from the house of Joseph. His leadership and influence made him a focal point for the growing discontent. The prophet Ahijah also played a significant role in Jeroboam's rebellion. Ahijah met Jeroboam and symbolically tore a new cloak into 12 pieces, giving 10 pieces to Jeroboam. This act represented God's decision to give Jeroboam rule over 10 tribes of Israel, leaving Solomon's son, Rehoboam, with only 2 tribes as a consequence of Solomon's disobedience and fulfillment for his punishment to Solomon. After receiving Ahijah's prophecy, Jeroboam began to plot against Solomon. Solomon became aware of Jeroboam's potential threat and sought to kill him. As a result, Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he stayed until Solomon's death. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became king. Jeroboam returned from Egypt and led a delegation representing the northern tribes to request a reduction in the heavy burdens imposed by Solomon. Rehoboam's harsh response led to the departure of the entire northern tribes from Israel. Deciding to stand on their own, they made Jeroboam their king, forming the separate kingdom of Israel, while Rehoboam ruled over the southern kingdom of Judah. This was a fulfillment of God's punishment to Solomon, but sadly, his son was the one who bore it. The things we do not have consequences on just us alone, but also on those we love. What can we learn from Solomon's fall? Like Solomon's, our hearts are fickle. While we're not likely to take on 700 spouses who want us to worship their statues, we are fairly prone to letting people, projects and passions become objects of our affection. The process by which we turn the good into gods and our loves into lords can be slow, subtle, and insidious. Solomon's example reminds us that we are not immune from the change that can enter our hearts when we fall in love with something besides God. We also can see the destruction that can follow when we seek to protect that love at all costs. We must remember that no matter how long we've been walking with God, no matter what we've accomplished or what tasks He has entrusted to us, we are and always will be vulnerable on this side of heaven. We're broken humans, and the enemy knows that taking down someone who's been walking faithfully with the Lord produces spiritual shrapnel. Solomon's fall into idolatry ultimately toppled a kingdom. Our fall could mean toppling our families, our marriages, our friends, and our churches. The warning from Solomon's example isn't meant to scare us, but to steady us. It's meant to highlight that no matter how many gifts God has given us or how faithfully we've walked with Him, we still need Him every single day. Each day, we're to steady our gaze on the God who got us this far and remember that only He and He alone can take us safely all the way to the finish line. If you found value in this video, please like and share what you think in the comments. There's more amazing content coming, so click subscribe to make sure you don't miss out. Meanwhile, you can click on any of the videos on the screen to learn more about Scripture. Thanks for watching, and may the Lord bless and guide your day.